Hello, boys and girls. I guess it's Jack and I today. I told Kane to go upstairs, but Jack decided he wanted to stay, so he's gonna take a little, I guess, rest, a little nap, while I read chapter 18 of Edward Tulane. So, the story's gonna get really good now, and we're getting towards the end, and the rest of the story has a lot to do with our newest character, Bryce, and his sister, Sarah Ruth. This character will be in the next few chapters, so we'll have to pay close attention to the kind of relationship he has with Edward. I'm going to read 18 and 19 today, and I'll stop along the way and discuss what's happening because it might get a little confusing. In chapter 17, we met Bryce's sister, Sarah Ruth. And if you remember, Sarah Ruth is younger than Bryce. She's only 4 years old. And they live in this, run-down little cabin. Really not much to it. It's basically one room. And Sarah Ruth stays in bed all day because she is quite sick. And in the book, she spends a lot of time coughing and can only say about one word at a time, or else she'll just start coughing. So she loved the little gift that Bryce brought back to her, which was Edward, and she renamed Edward Jangles, and she was really happy with her new toy, her new treasure. So today, let's go on to 18. There's a picture. It's a picture of a box of buttons. We'll have to figure out what that box of buttons has to do with Bryce and Sarah Ruth and Edward. Okay. All right. Now you also remember from chapter 17 and 16 that Bryce kept referring to a he. And this he that he talked about was not a nice man. He did a lot of things that were not nice to Bryce and Sarah Ruth. So this first sentence actually tells us who the he is. And maybe some of you had already guessed. Bryce and Sarah Ruth had a father. Early the next morning, when the light was gray and uncertain, Sarah Ruth was sitting up in bed, coughing, and the father came home. He picked Edward up by one of his ears and said, "I ain't never." "It's a baby doll," said Bryce. "Don't look like no baby doll to me." Edward, hanging by one ear, was frightened. This, he was certain, was the man who crushed the heads of china dolls. That was one of the things that he had done. He had taken Sarah Ruth's old china doll and crushed it. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth between coughs. She held out her arms. "He's hers," said Bryce. "He belongs to her." The father dropped Edward on the bed, and Bryce picked up the rabbit and handed him to Sarah Ruth. "It don't matter anyway," said the father. "It don't make no difference. None of it." "It does so matter," said Bryce. "Don't you sass me," said the father. He raised his hand and slapped Bryce across his mouth, and then he turned and left the house. "You ain't got to worry about him," said Bryce to Edward. "He ain't nothing but a bully. And besides, he don't hardly ever come home." Fortunately, the father did not come back that day. Bryce went out to work, and Sarah Ruth spent the day in bed, holding Edward in her lap and playing with a box filled with buttons. "Pretty," she said to Edward as she lined up the buttons on the bed and arranged them into different patterns. Now think about that. It seems there's no mother or grandmother or aunt, and the father is gone all day, and Bryce has to go work for the old lady, and this 4-year-old little girl who's so sick stays home alone in bed playing with a box of buttons all day. Sometimes, when a coughing fit was particularly bad, she squeezed Edward so tight that he was afraid he would crack in two. Also, in between coughing fits, she took to sucking on one or the other of Edward's ears. Normally, Edward would have found intrusive, clingy behavior of this sort very annoying. But there was something about Sarah Ruth. He wanted to take care of her. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to do more for her. Now, if you want to take care of someone, if you want to protect someone, if you want to do for someone, sounds an awful lot like you might have love for someone. Those are all things that people that you love, you do for. At the end of the day, Bryce returned with a biscuit for Sarah Ruth and a ball of twine for Edward. Twine is like really thin rope or string. Sarah Ruth held the biscuit in both hands and took small, tentative bites. "You eat that all up, honey. Let me hold Jangles," said Bryce. "Him and me got a surprise for you." Bryce took Edward off in a corner of the room, and with his pocket knife, he cut off lengths of twine and tied them to Edward's arms and feet, and then tied the twine to sticks of wood. "See, all day I've been thinking about it," Bryce said. "What we're going to do is make you dance. Sarah Ruth loves dancing. Mama used to hold on to her and dance her around the room. So there was a mama. So we have to assume that Mama probably died. Maybe she had the same sickness that Sarah Ruth had. So, do you understand what Bryce has done to Edward? He has taken his arms and legs, and he's tied the string around his arms and legs. And then he's holding on to pieces of wood, sort of like handles, and the wood goes to the string. So he pulls on the string, and his hands can dance. And he put it on his feet and his hands so that Edward can dance. If you know the name for this kind of doll, think about it. If you don't, it's called a marionette. A marionette. If you know Pinocchio, Pinocchio was like a marionette. "You eating that biscuit?" Bryce called out to Sarah Ruth. "Uh-huh," said Sarah Ruth. "You hold on, honey. We got a surprise for you." Bryce stood up. "Close your eyes," he told her. He took Edward over to the bed and said, "Okay, you can open them now." Sarah Ruth opened her eyes. "Dance, Jangles," said Bryce. And then, moving the strings with the sticks with his one hand, Bryce made Edward dance and drop and sway. And the whole while, at the same time, with his other hand, he held on to the harmonica and played a bright and lovely tune. Sarah Ruth laughed. She laughed until she started to cough. And then Bryce laid Edward down and took Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her and rubbed her back. "You want some fresh air?" he asked her. "Let's get you out of this nasty old air, huh?" Bryce carried his sister outside. He left Edward lying on the bed, and the rabbit, staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling, thought again about having wings. If he had them, he thought, he would fly high above the world to where the air was clear and sweet, and he would take Sarah Ruth with him. He would carry her in his arms, surely so high above the world she'd be able to breathe without coughing. After a minute, Bryce came back inside, still carrying Sarah Ruth. "She wants you too," he said. "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth. She held out her arms. So Bryce held Sarah Ruth, and Sarah Ruth held Edward, and the three of them stood outside. Bryce said, "Got to look for the falling stars. Them are the ones with magic." They were quiet for a long time, all three of them looking up at the sky. Sarah Ruth stopped coughing. Edward thought that maybe she had fallen asleep. "There," she said, and she pointed to a star streaking through the night sky. "Make a wish, honey," Bryce said, his voice high and tight. "That's your star. You make a wish for anything you want." And even though it was Sarah Ruth's star, Edward wished on it too. What do you think Edward would wish for? Maybe it's what he just talked about on the other page. I think it would be. All right, chapter 19, and we start with a picture. So, if you study the picture closely, you see the twine on the floor, and you see the twine is connected to Edward's hands and his feet. But there's Edward, and he's laying face down on the floor next to the bed. Doesn't look like a good place for Edward. The days passed. The sun rose and set again and again. Sometimes the father came home, and sometimes he did not. Edward's ears became soggy, and he didn't care. His sweater had almost completely unraveled. Didn't bother him. He was hogged half to death, and it felt good. In the evenings, at the hands of Bryce, at the ends of the twine, Edward danced and danced. 1 month passed, and then 2, and then 3. Sarah Ruth got worse. In the 5th month, she refused to eat. And in the 6th month, she began to cough up blood. Her breathing became ragged and uncertain, as if she was trying to remember, in between breaths, what to do, what breathing was. "Breathe, honey," Bryce stood over her and said. "Breathe," thought Edward from deep inside the well of her arms. "Please, please breathe." Bryce stopped leaving the house. He sat at home all day and held Sarah Ruth in his lap and rocked her back and forth and sang to her. On a bright morning in September, Sarah Ruth stopped breathing. "Oh no," said Bryce. "Oh, honey, take a little breath, please." Just take a minute and think about what just happened. I think this part's very sad. Very, very sad. It's sad for Bryce, and it's sad for Edward. Edward had fallen out of Sarah Ruth's arms the night before, and she had not asked for him again. So face down on the floor, arms over his head, Edward listened as Bryce wept. He listened as the father came home and shouted at Bryce. He listened as the father wept. Wept means they cried, so they're both crying. You can't cry, Bryce shouted. You got no right to cry. You never even loved her. You don't know nothing about love. I loved her, said the father. I loved her. I loved her too, thought Edward. I loved her. And now she's gone. How could this be? He wondered. How could he bear to live in a world without Sarah Ruth? The yelling between the father and son continued. And then there was a terrible moment when the father insisted that Sarah Ruth belonged to him, that she was his girl, his baby, and that he was taking her to be buried. She ain't yours, Bryce screamed. You can't take her. She ain't yours. Why would Bryce say that Sarah Ruth doesn't belong to the father? Sarah Ruth is his daughter, so why would Bryce say no? Think about that. Why Bryce is acting like that. But the father was bigger and stronger, and he prevailed. He won. He wrapped Sarah Ruth in a blanket and carried her away. The small house became very quiet. Edward could hear Bryce moving around, muttering to himself. And then finally, the boy picked Edward up. Come on, Jangles, Bryce said. We're leaving. We're going to Memphis. Now, you might not know what Memphis is. I'll bet Carson does. Memphis is a city in Tennessee. It's down south. In Tennessee is another state. And it's a big city, and it's famous for music. All kinds of music, but mostly country music. It's where a lot of country music singers play, and they have their concerts and things there. It's a big city, and it's very famous for music. So, do you think it would make sense for Bryce to go there with Edward? Think about that. Why would he go to Memphis with Edward? And there's a little picture here of Bryce and Edward. So we can clearly see there's definitely characters that have love, show love, give love. And then there are definitely characters that can't give love, can't show love, and don't even get love. And that's what makes an author write a protagonist and an antagonist. So, even though the book has a lot to do with love, giving and getting love, it also has a lot to do with not giving and getting love. So, tomorrow we will read chapter 20 and see what happens with Bryce and Edward when they get to Memphis. So, I will see you again in another video. Bye.